So the last type of use value are called option values. And this is the value of having something you might need to use in the future, but aren't using right now. I also briefly want to go through these non-use values before I jump into option values. These are values we give to biodiversity without using them. And one is existence value, and it's the value of having biodiversity or certain species without plans to ever use them. So it's the value of knowing that it's there. There's bequest value, and that's the value of having biodiversity available for future generations. And then there's inherent value or intrinsic value, saying that it has value of itself, and that we don't even need people to give value to it because it has value without us giving it value, if that makes any sense. All right, so let's go back to option value. Option value is the value of future discoveries. And a lot of option values have to do with genetic diversity. So this is things like genetic diversity in the wild relatives or domestic crops. So a lot of people study like the ancestral plant to corn so that they can think about new traits that we might need available in corn to deal with climate change or to deal with a new disease, things like that. We know that diverse crops are more resistant to pests and disease. And in fact, the Irish potato famine was caused by low genetic diversity of the potatoes being grown. So there just wasn't enough genetic diversity to deal with different changes in the environment. Another example is the citrus canker outbreak. We had low diversity in 1984 of our citrus, and this pest was able to take over the crop, and we didn't have any genetic diversity, so there weren't any individuals around able to deal with that. If we had more different varieties of citrus, it may have been that some may have done okay, while others would have failed. And so this genetic diversity is really valuable in developing new varieties as well. So we might be able to create new interesting colors or new flavors or different nutritional values for our different crops if we have this genetic diversity available. And genetic improvement of crops is big business. It's has increased revenue in the United States up to $15 billion per year. So they're always coming out with new kinds of crops, new varieties that are supposed to be better at dealing with all kinds of different things. Some are resistant to pesticides or herbicides. Some may just deal better with different diseases. Some may be more drought tolerant, so you don't have to use as much water to produce your crop. All these different kinds of improvements and different varieties can be made when we have this genetic diversity available. And similar, they've been working on increasing productivity in the developing world by creating new varieties as well. So searching for new biological resources is called bioprospecting. And the U.S. National Cancer Institute has been doing this, looking for medicines to treat cancer. It's also been used to look for drugs for AIDS, but also for lots of other things where they look at these different chemicals that are in a variety of different plants and animals to try and find new things that can be used for medicine or for inventions. GlaxoSmithKline signed a $3 million contract with the Brazilian government to be able to investigate 40,000 different species that are in the Amazon rainforest. Historically, this has not been done in a way that benefits the local communities. It often meant that people from the developed world, like the United States or Europe, go to countries and investigate different chemicals that different plants and animals make, and they take them from those countries and develop them in a lab, and there is absolutely no benefit to the local people that live and have been conserving those species in their native ecosystems. And some people have called this biopiracy, and they'll take it without even any compensation. So this kind of contract between GlaxoSmithKline and Brazil is supposed to be a way for the government to have an incentive to preserve these ecosystems to allow for bioprospecting. So if the burden is always on the other country to protect it, but they get no value from bioprospecting, then there's not really an incentive for them to continue to conserve this. If other people come into their country and take and make lots of money off these species that they have been protecting, then there's just not this incentive. So the idea is to create an incentive so that bioprospecting generates some revenue that can help go to preserving these ecosystems and these species that are valuable for science, for medicines, and different inventions. So a lot of countries now recognize this financial value of biological resources, and they tightly regulate what can be taken out of the country. So the next topic is to think about what happens when biodiversity isn't valued properly. We've gone through all these different values that biodiversity has and kind of thought about why we should value them. But what happens if we don't value them? And the answer is that resources become depleted or degraded. We will sometimes get extinctions, and people can lose money, health, and safety. So we talked about all these different kinds of values. So some of them have monetary value through direct use. Some of them contribute to health, like clean air and clean water. And some of them deal with safety. So things like preventing floods and mitigating the impacts of storms. These kinds of things have to deal with human safety. So we can lose these things if we're not considering the value of biodiversity when we make decisions in our society. And so this is called an externality. And basically an externality are hidden costs or benefits associated with an economic activity. Now these don't have to be environmental. They can be health or public good kind of things, not just environmental. So an externality in general can be positive or negative. So a positive would be a hidden benefit associated with an economic activity, and a negative externality would be a hidden cost. So this might be the degradation of ecosystem services when we do an economic activity that's not incorporated into the cost. If it's something that's incorporated into the cost, then it's not an externality. It's part of the economic activity itself. But it's when this cost isn't included in the actual price that we get externalities. So usually negative externalities are thought of as cost to society, not paid by the manufacturer or the consumer. So this might happen if we go back to the example of flooding in Houston. A company might build a big store with a big parking lot, and they're making lots of money by people coming into the store, but all the surrounding neighborhoods, when it rains a lot, get flooded, and there's all these costs associated with flooding. It's a cost to society, but the manufacturer and the people buying the goods in the store aren't contributing in any way to dealing with the losses that other people have from flooding. So that'd be an example of a negative externality. And so this just shows some different ones. So on the left side, we have examples of where ecosystems are preserved and there aren't a lot of negative externalities. Whereas on the right side, there are lots of negative externalities. So some examples are, we have clear cutting. So people are making money off of timber production, other goods from the trees, and this causes erosion, and this can pollute the river. We have intensive grazing by cows, so a lot of nutrient output in the form of the waste of these livestock is ending up in the river and polluting it and also causing more erosion. So the river, the water is not good. There's polluted runoff. And then we can't use this river for fishing, and the water is not of good quality. We also see streams carrying untreated wastewater, factories. Air pollution could be considered a negative externality, whereas we see a lot of other kinds of similar kinds of economic activities occurring over on the left side, but they're not resulting in these negative externalities. So we still have clean water in the river because the logging is done in a way to not cause erosion. There's not as many nutrients going into the river. We're treating the wastewater so that that's not polluting the river. And then we're still able to go do coastal fishing. And there's a wildlife refuge here. We're also getting ecotourism from this beach resort. So you can see kind of a comparison and some different examples of negative externalities here. Market failure is when externalities exist and are not accounted for. We have what's called market failure, where society fails to realize the full benefits of an economic activity. And so when we have all these negative externalities and they result in decreased overall economic value in our society, then we've had a market failure because we're not properly valuing things that are actually worth money but not incorporated into our economy. So we see with market failure that some individuals or benefits benefit at the expense of society. And so society as a whole becomes less prosperous rather than more prosperous from that economic activities.